So I like to start these things with a little journey of where I started and where I am now. This was my first Milky Way image back in 2012. It's a horrible picture. If you look really close, you can see the core of the Milky Way there through all the light pollution on the Oregon coast. I kind of dabbled around and did the same thing everybody does with a crop sensor camera and then eventually getting a full frame camera. And in 2015, I had a great conversation with Roger Clark, who talked earlier, and he just destroyed me and my picture quality. And then he kind of showed me his website way back when there was nothing on it but a few pages, and now it's like 100 pages of really good stuff. And eventually it led down this path to tracking mounts, and 2015, this is my first tracking mount image. It's awful. So this is what you get to look forward to. This is my latest panorama. I took this last month down in Escalante. And so that's just kind of, 7 years, four or 5 years with the tracking mount. That's, I'm like everybody else here. I'm constantly trying to improve, constantly trying to learn things. And I just wanted to show you guys, everybody starts somewhere, and it's just the journey. That's all it is. Just enjoy it. So what is a tracking mount? The basic terminology, like everything else you've learned about here, is that it's a tool. And in astrophotography and Nightscape photography, there's more than one way to skin this cat. And you can make it as simple or as complex as you want to make it. Tracking mounts tend towards the complex end. You're just adding more equipment, but at the end of the day, it's what you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with tracking mounts, great. If you're comfortable with single exposures, great. You just gotta find your niche. And so as a tool, it's there to facilitate your ability to do astrophotography. Cool, thank you. And like any tool, it's only as good as the person using it. When I started, I was awful with it. And it only takes a huge amount of hours under the night sky and ridiculous amount of dedication like anything, and eventually you'll get pretty good at it. So these come in a wide variety of flavors and sizes. Can you guys see the red laser pointer? Okay, this is a barn door tracker. Royce talked about it. You can build these things for, seriously, I've seen people build these for like $20 or $30, super cheap. And then they range from everything from like telescope-based mounts down to new ones that literally fit in the palm of your hand. So I have the new Skywatcher Star Adventurer Mini over there, and it fits in my hand. It's tiny and it works great. So you just, find one that works for you and go from there. So I'm going to cruise through this really fast because we kind of touched on it already. Earth rotates on a polar axis. As it rotates, you take along a picture, and what do you get? You get star trails, right? So the way a tracking mount works is you align it to the same polar axis, and it rotates in the opposite direction, and then you don't get star trails with longer exposures. Oh no, the dreaded polar alignment. Who here doesn't know how to find Polaris? Does everybody know what the Big Dipper is? You can find Polaris super easy. This is a screenshot of my Stellarium app on my phone. Here's the Big Dipper. The last two stars of the saucepan point straight to Polaris. If it takes you more than 5 seconds, you're probably in very light polluted or just really poor skies. So how do you do this polar alignment crazy stuff that's supposed to take 2 hours and be impossible and just ruin your whole night with a tracking mount? Well, if you're shooting up to a wide angle lens with like 85 millimeters or less, just throw your mount on the tripod, throw your camera on the mount, find Polaris with your eyes and just kind of roughly move your mount in that direction. Take your favorite laser pointer. Every mount has basically 3 kind of attachments to it. First, this one has a polar scope that runs through the body of the mount. Some of them are on the side, some of them you have to attach. And then every mount has 2 sets of screws. One adjusts the mount left and right, and the other one adjusts the mount up and down. Take a laser pointer, hold it up to the polar scope, turn it on, and then adjust the mount. That's all you have to do. If it takes you more than a minute to polar align your mount doing this, you just have to point the laser at Polaris, and then you're done. I promise you, it doesn't have to be perfect. and then get your favorite beer and take some pictures.
How you did it on that last shot?
I don't even use the laser pointer anymore. Like, it's just second nature to me, but I recommend people use the laser pointer just until you're very comfortable with finding Polaris in the scope. So like out here in these dark skies, when you look through the scope with your eye, you're gonna see a billion stars. And you're gonna be like, oh, which one's Polaris? Use the laser pointer. I was showing everybody in my workshops last 2 nights the laser pointer trick. It'll save you just a lot of heartache and time, and it'll cut your polar alignment down to a minute or less. So the next big problem is I can't see Polaris. I can't use my mount, right? Not true. There's a very, very easy way to do this. Same thing, you'll get it done in less than 5 minutes. All you need to know is your GPS latitude, and then you need a compass. So I use a compass app on my phone, and then you need what's called an angle finder or an inclinometer. You can buy those at Home Depot. I have another app on my phone that does the same thing. So this is my polar alignment app that Skywatcher uses. Up here in the corner, it has find your location. There's my latitude. I just need that latitude number, 38 degrees here in Moab. I've set up my mount in this picture, and on the phone, I have a compass app. I just orient the mount north using the compass or the compass app. Then you use your inclinometer, hold it on the side of the mount that's pointing towards Polaris, rotate it up and down until you're at 38 degrees, which is our latitude here, and you're polar aligned. That's it. So is it super critical for wide-angle astrophotography? No, it's not. Not long after I got my first iOptron, I was out and about and it was cloudy and I wasn't doing much, so I decided to throw my $200 Samyang lens on the mount. And back then, the polar alignment apps, they didn't tell you that some polar scopes are mirrored in both axes. And so my app is like, oh, put Polaris down here. But my polar scope was mirrored, so it should have been up here. This is a 15-minute exposure with the Samyang 85mm lens with Polaris in the exact opposite spot of where it's supposed to be. So you tell me. Okay, this is a huge list of pros and cons. When I do these presentations, if I can't get my point across in half an hour, am I going to do it in an extra 15 minutes? Probably not. So I'm going to try and just not totally blast through these, but I just want to get these basic ideas down. And I don't want to bombard you guys with a huge amount of information. So I've limited the pros to maybe like the most important 2 or 3. I've limited the cons to the most important 2 or 3. And then, if you have more questions, come and ask me, or I'll give you my email. I try very hard to help people as much as I can. That's what I love doing these days, is just teaching everybody how to use these things properly. Because there's a lot of information on the internet now, but when I started, there was no information. So it was all just fill it out and figure it out. And I try to encourage that as much as possible. Just figure things out that work for you and then go from there. All right. Oh, let me get my water bottle so I don't start squeaking. So the single biggest contributor to image quality is lens performance. I don't care if you have a $10,000 camera. If you put a junk lens on it, you're going to take a junk picture. That's all there is to it. And so I showed that picture with that $200 Samyang lens, and it's a pretty good picture. And tracking mounts allow for that. So I can turn a pretty mediocre lens into a solid performer just by stopping it down 1 or 2 or 3 stops. And tracking mounts allow that. When you're shooting from a fixed tripod with a single exposure, you want to shoot a lens wide open, right? Like you need to collect as much light as you possibly can, and that makes sense. And so this is a comparison between another Samyang lens. This is the $400 24mm f1.4. This is the $1,600 Canon 24mm f1.4L. This Canon lens is like legendary, right? Well, wide open, the Samyang lens is the winner. I mean, the sharpness is pretty comparable between the two. And when you look at the coma and the chromatic aberration and those kinds of things, the Samyang's even a little bit better. But when you stop these lenses down, 2.8, Samyang gets better, but the Canon really gets better. It gets much sharper. Coma goes away, chromatic aberration goes away. All of a sudden, that $1,600 price tag, that makes a little bit more sense because the image quality from that lens is going to be substantially higher. So this is just a good corner coma comparison. Marianne Oland from DP Review, she does these for various 35 millimeter and 50 millimeter lenses. I personally love shooting nightscapes with 50 millimeters, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so she did one with this is the new Nikon 50 millimeter that just came out for the Z cameras, and then some other pretty common lenses. This was my former favorite lens, the Sigma 50 Art. That lens is just absolutely incredible sharpness, but it suffers from really bad coma wide open. And I mean, look at these other 50 millimeter lenses. This is awful. You don't want to use these lenses wide open if you don't have to. If you do, you're going to end up, doing panoramas and overlapping the shots 50% just so you can avoid this terrible coma. But what happens when you stop it down a little bit better? Stop it down to 2.8, it's almost completely gone. And so, when you shoot from a fixed position, you need to collect as much light as you possibly can in a short amount of time. But with a tracking mount, you stop it down 2 stops, your exposure time goes from, say, 15 or 30 seconds to 1 or 2 minutes. And then it just gives you that latitude and that freedom to make choices based on the equipment you have. All right, so chromatic aberration. This is kind of the bane of my existence right now. This is from that new Nikon 50 millimeter for the Z cameras. It still has really bad chromatic aberration. And the harder you push your editing in post-processing, the more that chromatic aberration is going to jump out at you. And so I'm still kind of struggling with this, but I was hoping to use this lens at 2.2 because the coma is really good and it's really, really sharp. But it turns out the chromatic aberration at 2.2 is pretty bad. It's hard to see in this picture. But at 2.8, it's a lot better. And so again, that's the benefit of being able to use a tracking mount. You can adjust your lens settings to maximize image quality, whereas when you're shooting from a fixed tripod, you just want to collect as much light as you possibly can. So a better lens, ultimately, better lens performance ultimately means better outcomes for the things you usually do, like creating panoramas. Now I overlap my pano shots on the tracking mount 10 to 20%. Who here takes panos and overlaps each shot 10%? Nobody, right? You can't do that if you shoot it wide open. It's before I was overlapping my shots 30 to 50%. That's just kind of the norm. But being able to stop it down means I don't have that edge coma and that edge chromatic aberration and distortion problems. And so you can get away with less overlap, and that saves you time in the long run because you have to take fewer exposures. And then seeing things like stacking and masking, those just become easier because the edge-to-edge performance of every exposure is much higher. And so that reduces software problems in terms of aligning pictures and aligning stars. All right, let's talk about the 8 billion pound elephant in the room, dynamic range. We've heard so much about dynamic range. I'm not going to belabor this point any more than we already have. We saw another kind of presentation like this, and I wanted to show this again because I get questions all the time okay, you're using tracking mounts. The next step, you want to buy a better camera, right? Who always has gear acquisition syndrome? Who doesn't want to spend $3,000 on a brand new Nikon Z7 like I did? Spoiler alert, sensor improvements in the last 5 years haven't been that great. So on this graph, I've plotted, this is a 5D Mark III, the new Canon R, the Fuji X-T2, old Nikon D600, the new Sonys, the old Sonys. I got a Pentax. I even got the $7,000 Leica on here. Above ISO 800, nobody's going to shoot lower than 800 for Astro for Nightscape purposes. It's pointless. There's no reason. What is this difference? Half a stop? Like you're talking like $1,000 Fuji versus a $7,000 Leica, and you're getting half a stop of dynamic range improvement. Forget it. Like buy the camera or use the camera that you have. Don't worry about sensor. If you have a camera built in the last 5 years, the sensor is going to be good enough. But one thing is universally true. When you when you increase ISO, your dynamic range decreases. And so I want to put this in a way that just makes it as simple as possible. Dynamic range is data. It is your camera's ability to record data, whether it's in shadows or highlights or wherever. When you increase ISO and decrease dynamic range, you shrink the window of your camera's ability to record data. So if you're shooting at 12,800, you might be able to get a good dynamic range and you might be able to get all the information you need, but your window is really short. You might be stuck at a 20-second exposure with your settings. 25 seconds might clip all the highlights off. 15 seconds might clip all the shadows off. But if you can lower the dynamic range, you increase that window a little bit. Maybe it's just like a stop or two, but now you can take like 1-minute exposures and not clip highlights. You could take like 30-second exposures and not clip shadows. And so it gives you more freedom to take longer or shorter exposures without losing that information. And really that information is, sorry, I got ahead of myself. So we also talked about how Nightscapes might not have huge dynamic range. And so you might not need lower ISOs and more dynamic range. I think it's baloney. Nightscapes have massive dynamic range. When you're talking about taking a Nightscape photo, has anybody here taken a Nightscape photo and not either clipped a highlight or clipped a shadow? I never have. I mean, I shoot at ISO 400 sometimes and I still clip highlights and I still clip shadows. Like that's just the nature of the game. It's impossible to all get it in one exposure. And so this is massive dynamic range. And what does that mean? Like you're going to lose some information eventually. And that information is really color. If you're shooting at a high ISO and a low dynamic range, you're going to lose these star colors, this nebula color. This is the North American nebula. And if you can't recover shadows, you won't recover that. If you can't recover highlights, you won't see yellow stars. You won't see white stars, or you'll see a lot of white stars, but you won't see like blue, orange, red. That information just gets lost faster. And so using a tracking mount lets you lower the ISO to the applicable ISO. For some cameras, you don't want to go below 1600 because it introduces my next slide. Noise becomes a problem. So we talked about, everyone's like, oh, are you taking like 3 to 5 minute exposures? What does that do for noise? So 30 seconds at 1600. This is a test you can all do. This is a very simple test. Take your camera, put your lens cap on, and then take an exposure. It'll be completely black like you expect. But then when you open that exposure in Photoshop or whatever, zoom in 100% or 200% and then raise the exposure 3 or 4 stops and you'll see all the sensor noise. So this is the noise associated with just the sensor. 30 seconds at 1600, okay, what does that mean? 30 seconds at 12,800. It's like, holy crap, it looks like a CRT monitor from back in the day. 3 minutes at ISO 800. Pretty comparable to the 30 seconds at 1600, right? When you take these long exposures, for the most part, unless it's like 95 degrees out, you're just not going to see a ton of thermal noise. So this was shot These exposures were shot in my hotel room over there at 70 degrees. So it's not like this was taken in an icebox or something. And then the other thing I want to mention is, for the love of all that is holy, do not use long exposure noise reduction. Turn it off. Never, ever turn it on. This is without that function. And this is with that function across all 3 frames. What do you notice? Like a little bit more green noise, right? It's just all you will do with LENR is waste your time. And your time is so valuable. If I'm taking a 3-minute exposure and I have to sit there for 6 minutes, like forget about it. I'll take 3 exposures in a whole night at that rate. It's just a complete waste of time. So please do not use LENR. All right. Longer focal length, more detail. Who here has taken a 135 millimeter Nightscape? Cool. Not too many people, right? So using a tracking mount means I'm not subject to the rules of 200, 300, 400, 500, whatever 100 you want to use. I can take a long exposure at any focal length with a good amount of accuracy. And so, longer focal lengths mean you can resolve more detail in nebula, in galaxies, and all the dust and cool stuff that you want to see. And then you can use a better lens performance to bring that detail out. And that's what it's really all about for me. And so using a tracking mount means my creative possibilities have increased. I can use a 135 millimeter lens. I don't want to walk 5 miles to that tree on top of a hill to use my 20 millimeter lens to take a picture. I'll just throw my 135 on there and, hike 100 yards or something. So just having the plethora of lens focal lengths to choose from means that, it opens the door to more possibilities. And that's what you need to take into account. You want to be good photographers. You don't want to be stuck with a 20 millimeter lens or a 25 millimeter lens and a 30-second exposure. Why limit yourself like that? It also opens the door to stuff like this. So this is that cheap Samyang 200. I bought this lens for $200, not even joking. And this is a panorama. So if you split this image long-wise in half and then cut it into thirds, it's basically a stack of 6 panels and then stitched together. Not very long. I mean, each panel was about 10 minutes of total exposure. So yeah, it's pretty cool just being able to do stuff like this with cheap lenses and not very much effort. This is the Orion Nebula. I shot this with a Nikon D7000 and the Tamron 150-600 on the original Ioptron Sky Tracker. No counterweight, nothing like that. And I did this from my driveway in Salt Lake City. Yeah, I mean, it opens the door to things like this. It's not easy. I'm not gonna tell you it's just something you're gonna do from day one. I wouldn't be up here talking to you if I didn't spend a stupid amount of time figuring out all these little tips and tricks. And people will tell you I'm a cheapo. I buy cheap little brackets and stuff, but they work. And so do that. Really right stuff makes really great stuff, but it's $300, and I guess I'm kind of cheap. And I've tried everything from macro rails to improve balance for these kinds of things, and it gives you options, and that's what I want to give you, more options to do this kind of stuff. So this is a pretty standard Milky Way Nightscape that I took, I don't know, maybe 2014, a D600 and a Takina 11-16. It's noisy. There's some star trailing. All the stars are white, and you can barely see Lagoon. You can barely see Omega and Eagle. Pretty typical stuff, though, right? Nothing crazy. This is one I took last month as well. This is down in Escalante. This is with the Z7 and a 50 millimeter lens. I mean, you can better resolve details. Lagoon and all these nebulas stand out. Rho Ophiuchi looks, nice and clean and sharp. And even your foregrounds. Your foregrounds will improve because you can stop it down. I've disliked this lens a little bit because it's got mechanical elements in it. And so when you turn the camera off, it resets focus. And so like halfway through this, I had to turn the camera off for some reason, like the battery was dying. Well, it reset the focus on the lens, and I didn't realize it. And so I kept taking the pictures, and then I got home, and it was like slightly out of focus. But the beauty of using like a 50 millimeter versus a 20 millimeter is that focus shift wasn't so dramatic, and I can sharpen that up pretty easily in post-processing. All right. Considerations. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. I wish it was just like you're going to buy one of these and you're going to enjoy it from the first minute and, it's going to be the be-all, end-all of all your Nightscape problems. That's just not reality. There's no all-in-one solution for any piece of equipment for this stuff. So what are the main considerations? First and foremost is time. My goodness, I've spent a huge amount of time doing all of this. And I can't emphasize this enough, but your time under dark skies is money. Dark skies are innately valuable. Like, you just have to enjoy and use every second you possibly can. So, for some people, they like to shoot 5 or 10 different locations in a night. You're probably not going to do that with a tracking mount. It takes more time to learn. It takes more time to set up. There's things you have to remember. I've hiked out in the middle of nowhere, like many, many miles, carrying all this equipment. And I forgot one stupid 1/4 to 3/8 adapter, and I couldn't use the mount the rest of the night. So, that doesn't mean you can't do other night photography. You just kind of plan for that, but you just have to remember those little things. Little details become that much more important. So more time for each exposure, right? Like I'm not doing 15 to 30 second exposures. I'm doing 3 minutes to 5 minutes. When you're doing long sky exposures, your foreground gets blurred. So you have to take sky and foreground exposures separately. You essentially doubled your time right there, right? Like even if you wanted to take a single exposure of the sky and a single exposure of the foreground, that's probably like 10, 15 minutes of aligning and getting your exposure set up and taking those pictures. So, and then finally, it possibly might result in more time spent post-processing. And that's kind of up to you. When I really got into this, I really went off the deep end, right? I made it as complex as it possibly could be. I was doing tracking and stacking and like calibration with dark frames and flat frames. We've mentioned these a little bit. And so you can make it as time consuming as you want. There's no upper limit really. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to take more time in post-processing, but it definitely can. So any guesses on how long it took me to get all of the exposures for this picture?
2 hours? 3 hours? 4 hours? 20 minutes?
This is a 38 exposure panorama taken with a D800 and a Sigma Art 50, and it took about 2.5 hours to set up and collect just the exposures. And so this was like 3 rows of exposures. I think it might have even been 4. And I spent at least 10 hours post-processing on this single image. And so I'm not gonna shade it any other color, The last 2 nights I've taken my workshops out and we shot at 2 locations each night. And, each person probably spent an hour to an hour and a half setting up their gear, getting their exposures right, taking test exposures, making the mount work properly, weight balancing it, polar aligning it. It takes that time. And that's not necessarily for everybody. And I don't want it to be for everybody. You know, I want everybody to try what works for them. So it does require complex post-processing techniques. You have to take sky and foreground exposures. And when you include certain foregrounds, they have things like trees and arches, and you can shoot at cool places with like intricate structure. You can go to Anza Borrego and take pictures of the cool statues and that kind of stuff. And when you include those things, those elements can complicate the post-processing. So on the left here is the unedited, untracked shot of that tree in the previous picture, and then on the right is the track shot. And look at this tree. I mean, it's really blurry, but most importantly, there's gaps in between the branches. And so when you go to post-process, if you don't take the time to mask and blend those gaps properly, it looks like junk. And then you have to do warping to hide the blurry trees, and you have to align it properly. And if you like bump your camera and screw up the alignment between the foreground and sky, you know, it just, these are little things that you have to consider. And so this is the arch in that previous shot. And you'll notice, you know, the untracked shot, the arch is about that big, but look at the tracked shot. It's a little bit smaller, right? So when you track and it includes that foreground, gaps and things decrease just a little bit. And so when you go back into post-processing, you either have to warp this out a little bit, or you use your clone stamp and you're just sitting there like cloning out the edge 1,000 times. So, you know, just things to think about. Probably the most common artifact in beginner tracking mount images is not matching your exposure histograms. And so this is that really crappy first tracked image I ever took. And this is just like the hallmark of all the post-processing and image acquisition problems that can go wrong with a tracked shot. If you look down here on the right, what do you notice? Like the highlights on the foreground are much brighter than the horizon of the tracked shot. I didn't mask these like star trails out properly. And this is hard. Holy cow. If you include trees in your tracked shots, trees are the bane of my existence, man. There are times where I'm like this is up in the Uintas. I go up there all the time because it gets hot, right, in Utah, and I love going up there because it cools off. But there's a lot of trees in the forest, and it's really, really hard to avoid including trees and cool lake shots and stuff like that. And so I don't want to scare anybody off of this, but I have spent just a horrible amount of hours. And Mike showed a great way how to kind of blend trees, and I'm going to take that back and incorporate that into my post-processing. But masking trees stinks so bad. It just sucks. So this is the other side of that image, and what do you see? Of course, everybody who does a tracked image, they're like, oh, I can edit the crap out of this and blow the contrast out and just go wild. And so the sky along the horizon is super dark. I'm sorry, this is posterized pretty bad from the zooming in wildly. So the horizon is really dark because I just went buck wild, right, with the contrast, and the color sucks. And then the foreground is super bright because I'm going to show all this detail in the foreground, and then it looks really weird because, does that look natural to you? Does the foreground matching the sky look natural to you at all? No, of course not. It's because I didn't take the time to really look at the histograms and match those highlight structures and the shadow structures. And so when you look at the lake, the horizon on the lake is really, really bright. That doesn't match that at all. And the foreground of the mountain is really bright compared to the sky. And so, you just have to take the time to dial in those details and get used to matching the light gradients between foreground and sky, and just things to keep in mind. All right, the money factor. Holy cow. If you get deep into this, you will spend a lot of money. So this setup, this is the Mini, the Skywatcher Star Adventurer Mini, $250 for this mount. And then like the tripod and all the other stuff, pretty standard, nothing more than a couple $100. I have this is my portable telescope mount over here. These start at like $1,300. And so like the portable mounts, you're probably not going to spend more than like $400 for everything. And that's pretty reasonable. I mean, how many of you spent over $1,000 on a lens or like a couple $1,000s on a camera body? Well, I can probably take better pictures with a $200 Samyang 85 millimeter lens with a tracking mount than you can with like a $2,000 Canon 85 millimeter lens. And so that money just kind of gets redistributed, right? So I spent $400 or something on these little mounts, and then I can choose my price and optical qualities of other lenses and equipment that just increase that image quality. So most people will start out with a wide angle. Everybody shoots nightscapes at like 16 to 20, 24 maybe. And the thing I always see is like within 3 or 6 months of buying a tracking mount, people are like, so what's your favorite 50 millimeter lens? What's your favorite like 85? What's your favorite 100? And then they're like, oh shoot, I just dropped like $2,000 on a telescope and now I'm broke and my wife or whoever hates me. And I'm like, yeah, that's the rabbit hole. It gets expensive quick, just like anything else. And so I really encourage using tracking mounts, but I tell people this. Starting at 50 millimeters of focal length, every doubling of that focal length increases the technical difficulty of using tracking mounts 10 times. That 10 times increase in difficulty means you need to invest that much more time and more money and more effort into making it work properly. And so, not to scare you, but that costs money. Time is money. And whether you buy more equipment or you just invest more time, that's what it comes down to. So the next thing you know, you've got an observatory. This isn't mine. This is my girlfriend's observatory. She has an observatory in their side yard. This is a telescope with a 2,350 millimeter focal length. And this mount and telescope is taller than I am. And so you can stand in there pretty easily. The dog loves astrophotography too. But you get to take pretty cool pictures. So this is the Whirlpool Galaxy, very minimal integration time total. I think it's like a total of 2 hours of integration time. And this is 23 plus million light years away. And so it's a lot of fun. It's frustrating as heck to really get it to work right, but man, you can take some really cool pictures with this stuff. And so the last thing I really want to put onto you guys is that tracking mounts, there's pros and cons and all that kind of stuff. Tracking mounts take time, but they give you time too. They give you time when you're sitting around taking long exposures to sit down and enjoy the dark skies. I mean, 80+% of the world's population lives in places where they'll never see the Milky Way. I mean, you guys are like the 1%ers here. You're in Bortle 1 class skies, and that doesn't exist in a lot of places around the world, and most of the people don't get to see those things. And so it's really, really easy for us, the presenters have done a fantastic job of giving you tools to go out and take great pictures, but don't get sucked into the back of your camera. And I really love this about tracking mounts. I take 3-minute exposure, and then I can sit down and drink some water and just, I see meteors, I see galaxies, and I see all this cool stuff. I've seen the aurora by chance, and the only reason that would have happened is because I was using a tracking mount, and I was just kind of standing there like, oh, hey, that's the aurora. Like, just incredible. So take the time to sit down and look at the sky and enjoy the fact that you're seeing something that very, very few people get to see. And then the last thing I really want to say is thanks to Royce and thanks to the people who helped put this conference on. I mean, like Mike mentioned, we're a community, and it blows my mind how big it's gotten in the last 2 to 3 years. If you would have told me 3 years ago that I'd be standing in front of like 100 plus people giving a talk about tracking mounts, I would have just laughed in your face. Like there's no way this could have happened without not just Royce and not just the presenters and the helpers, but you guys. Like, take solace in the fact that this has become a pretty cool thing, and it's popular enough now that we can have conferences in Moab and Las Vegas next year. Like, so yeah, that's all I got. Thank you.
How do you do panoramas on your tracking mount?
Ha! Panoramas. Everybody hates panoramas. And everybody in my workshops. Will you turn the lights on? Sweet. Thank you. This is the Mini, okay? When you buy like the regular Star Adventurer and the iOptrons and stuff, they come with the declination bracket, right? But then you have to put like a ball head on it, and it's tough. It's a pain in the butt to do panos with a ball head on the tracking mount. What I did is I kind of Frankenstein the declination bracket. I took that platform off, and then this is a Z bracket. But you can also, I've also used 3-way geared heads. I've used 2-way pano heads. Making a level base on that sucker, and then putting one of these pano heads on top of this. It only adds like maybe a pound of weight, and then I haven't looked through my viewfinder on my camera in like a year using this stuff. So I put the pano head on there and the camera on there. On this one, I have glow-in-the-dark masking tape. And so I don't even have to turn my headlamp on, right? Like I could see how many degrees I just need to move the pano head. And so I just put a pano head on a level base. There's lots of different ways to make a level base. This is a Z bracket. It works pretty well with lightweight cameras and lenses, but pano heads and 3-way heads work pretty well too. And they just screw on to the declination bracket there. Did everybody hear the question?
No.
How do you do panoramas on a tracking mount? Probably the hardest, and like this is why I teach workshops, because it's really stinking hard to do panoramas on a tracking mount. And so my suggestion is to take whatever the declination bracket for your tracking mount is, and then put a leveling, in this case I have a Z bracket on here. You can use a 3-way geared head or a 2-way pano head, and it just makes a very level platform on that bracket. It just screws on there. And then you can put a panorama head on top of here and do all sorts of cool I've seen people use gimbal heads, and we talked about Paul Wilson, and I've had a lot of conversation with him, and he's done like the automated, what do they call those, iPano automated heads. He's put one of those on tracking mounts and done like crazy huge resolution tracked panos before. So that's my suggestion.
Are you using a counterweight with that?
I am not. The Z7 and the new 50 millimeter lens weighs all of 2.5 pounds. Okay. I do not need to use, people are like, if I put the Sigma Art 85 millimeter, that's like a 2.5 pound lens. So the rule, his question was, do you use the counterweight? I do not when I use my lightweight mirrorless and lens. And the general rule in astrophotography is to not exceed half the payload capacity of your mount. Yeah. So, that's the beauty of the Z7 and those new lenses. They weigh nothing. And so the payload capacity of the Mini is like 6 pounds or 5.5 pounds. And so 2.5 pounds that's not even half of the capacity. This is the original one, and I have the counterweight on there. So when I use that Sigma Art lenses, they weigh like 2+ pounds. I'll use the counterweight on here, and it helps a lot to balance that weight when you're swinging things around. So it just depends on the weight of your setup.
So I have the Mini as well, but I have a Canon
camera and heavier lenses. Can I get by with a counter?
You got to try it. I wish I could give you the answer. And so I definitely recommend orienting the stuff on your camera slightly to the east. Do you understand? So when you're polar aligning your mount, you want weight slightly to the east. But I keep mine vertical. The window of it rotating is a little bit shorter before it feels like it's going to tip off either direction. But it's easier to kind of control that weight distribution when it's up and down, rather than having the camera like over here and a counterweight over here. It's just a little bit simpler and easier for me to keep it slightly to the east, but more vertical. Does that make sense?
I believe so, yeah.
Howard?
Doesn't the tracker throw off what you thought was a level horizon as it proceeds across?
I wish I would have incorporated that into the slideshow. But so the question was, when you use a tracker and you do a panorama, does the horizon shift a little bit between exposures? Yes, it does. So when I take a 3-minute exposure, I always include a little bit of the horizon when I do my tracked sky shots, so I have a visual cue of where that picture needs to align with the foreground shot. Of course, it comes blurry, and when I shift from one exposure to the next, what's happened is that it's tracked up, and then you come over and you reset it, and it's offset a little bit. And so when you stitch those pictures, there's a little bit of an artifact where like the horizon from one picture is a little bit lower than the horizon of the other picture. I hide that. I mask it. I cheat. But you don't have to, it's not so dramatic that you have to like do these crazy composite techniques and pull it way down below the horizon of your untracked shot.
What software are you using to stitch?
I use Calar Auto Pano Giga. They don't sell licenses anymore, but I've used PT GUI a lot, and PT GUI works fantastic, like Mike showed.
You mentioned polar alignment with a laser pointer.
Yes.
Do you use that on the wide field, the wide lenses, as well as the longer lenses? Or do you need more precision when you're shooting with something like 85 or longer?
When you're shooting longer than 85, definitely need more precise. And so I don't want to. Oh,
Yeah, just hold it closer.
sorry. So the question was, how precise do you need to use? Whoa, things have gotten frisky here. I'm sorry, I stink really bad too. How precise does a polar alignment need to be when you're doing longer? When I do the longer focal length stuff, I usually start with the laser pointer just to get Polaris in there because I'm lazy. With the wider angle stuff, I've gotten so used to just finding Polaris in the sky. It's not hard for me. I throw it in the circle within the realm. So the reticule is like a clock, right? And it's by hours. And as long as I'm within like 6 hours or 12 hours, I'm pretty good in terms of tracking. But the laser pointer is just an easy way for me to get Polaris in the scope. Because in dark places like this, it's even hard for me to pick Polaris out of like all the stars in the sky. Does it make sense?
I have kind of a random question that I've been curious about for a while, but I bet you've got the technical to answer. In the old ancient days of silver image photography, there was a phenomenon of reciprocity failure where the exposure rate changed. Is the exposure rate on a modern digital camera absolutely linear, or is there anything like reciprocity failure in the image chemistry or physics?
So the question is about reciprocity failure and image acquisition with a modern camera versus a film camera. Sensors aren't entirely linear, and so that website that I showed comparing all the sensors, I'm sorry for stepping on your stuff, that's Bill Claff's website, Photons to Photos, and you will not find a more comprehensive sensor analysis website on the internet. There isn't one that exists. And he has done a lot of not just dynamic range, but read noise and other metrics like this. I don't want to answer exactly. and he's very responsive. If you shoot him an email, he will give you a much more technical answer than I possibly can give. I know sensors are not linear, and there's like, he does photon response curves, and there's certainly non-linear ranges where reciprocity failure can occur, but I don't want to say one way or another. Sound good?
Yeah, are you using mostly prime lenses?
Yeah. Zoom lenses have gotten better in the last few years. The new Tamron was at the 15 to 30, 2.8, fantastic lens. But for the most part, zoom lenses are not optically as great as prime lenses. Now, prime lenses generally suffer from like worse coma and stuff like that. But having the ability to stop down the lens is huge. And zoom lenses are kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none, except for some of the new ones are pretty good. But I think for the most part, most prime lenses are substantially better optical quality than zooms, my opinion.
Equipment on you're using the new Nikon camera. Are you happy with it?
I am happy with it. It was expensive, but like I said, I would have gone with the Z6, and Mary Beth has the Z6, but the Z6 has the anti-aliasing filter that Spencer was talking about, and I like the added sharpness of non-anti-aliasing filter cameras. The problem is the files are massive. So I have a home-built PC, and it can handle them, but if I try to use my laptop to process those like 45 megabyte files, it just struggles. So I like the Z7, good sensor, but the sensor's not all that much better than anything that's been created in the last 5 years. So it, like I said, I think shoot with the camera you got and you make the best of it. But I don't want to dissuade people from upgrading.
Are you dating your girlfriend just for a telescope?
I'm not going to let her watch this. No, she is a fantastic astrophotographer herself, and she does nightscapes, really good nightscapes, and the telescope is a perk. Yeah, exactly.
One last one. When you say matching the histograms on your different, segments that you're shooting, are you talking post or in camera?
In camera. So when you take your sky exposure, you want that 1/3 peak, kind of like we talked about. You want the peak off that left edge about 1/3, so you don't clip highlights. It's really easy to be like, okay, the foreground is super shadowy, but if you're not careful and you include horizon in that foreground, chances are if you do the typical 4 times the foreground of the sky or whatever, chances are you're going to clip highlights in that foreground. And when you do that and you try to recover it, you get a lot of color fringing along those highlight edges, and it makes it just nearly impossible to blend those. So highlight control in the foreground is like the hardest thing to do when you take dark foreground exposures. And so I try my best to match the highlights especially and still get those shadows off the left edge. But once I get the left shadow peak off that left edge of the histogram, that's good enough for me. And post-processing software has gotten good enough to handle shadow noise and that kind of stuff. He's over here creeping on me.